So today my presentation is about the world of watches and the parts of watches that I find most interesting in today's modern digital age. And I want to start this presentation by asking a very interesting question to you all, which is, are analog watches even relevant anymore? It seems like all of the gadgets we have around us, from smartphones to laptops to smart watches, are extremely intelligent and can provide us information that far exceeds the capabilities of a normal analog watch. Just a few examples here on the left are showing information ranging from steps you've taken on a run, to the weather outside, to the amount of beats per minute that your heart is beating at. So it seems like watches have transformed from a simple timekeeping device to a health tracking or status updating device. And that seems to be the main purpose of watches today. And so in this backdrop of digital reality, the question is there really a need for these typical traditional analog watches like the Omega Speedmaster that I've shown on the right? And my answer, or my argument to this question, is that yes, in this modern digital age, the appreciation for the craftsmanship and mechanical wizardry that goes into these watches is appreciated more than ever before. And I want to give some ideas on exactly how complicated these watches are and just how amazing the engineering is that goes into them. So the first distinction I want to make between different types of analog watches is this idea of quartz crystal watches versus truly mechanical watches. A quartz crystal watch is actually basically an electronic watch that happens to deliver a mechanical output in the form of minute, hour, and seconds hands moving on the face. The way a quartz crystal watch works is that there's a battery, which is not shown here, but it's in that little case that you see there. And the battery sends a simple electrical charge to a quartz crystal. Think of a quartz crystal as the electrical version of a tuning fork. It resonates at a very specific frequency, and it does this extremely accurately forever in theory. So the quartz crystal, upon receiving this electrical charge, will resonate at a very specific frequency. Almost all quartz crystal watches resonate at 32,768 hertz. And this number wasn't picked arbitrarily. It's actually a power of 2. So the idea is that the quartz crystal will resonate at this frequency, and it will send an electronic signal that corresponds to this frequency back to an electrical circuit. And this circuit essentially uses this oscillating wave to count out cycles in time. And once those number of cycles reach 1 second, it then sends a signal to an electromagnet, which simply just moves a second hand 1 increment on the clock. And just through the magic of the gear sets, the second hand then moves the minute hand and the hour hand. And this is why when you look at a normal quartz crystal watch, the second hand actually moves in very discrete steps. It's literally stepping through 1 second increments on the watch. Quartz crystal watches are incredibly cheap to manufacture, and that's why the majority of cheap retail watches you see are quartz crystal watches. But the real magic is actually in mechanical watches. The mechanical watch I've shown on the left is actually an automatic mechanical watch. And the way it works is that there's a big rotating mass called the rotor. And whenever you move your hand up and down, or just through the normal motions of life, this rotor moves around the case and it winds something called a mainspring. And the mainspring stores the mechanical energy from the rotating motion of that rotor. And the energy stored in that mainspring is eventually delivered through gear sets to the actual movements of the hands on the dial. Now, there's an even cooler version of mechanical watches, which are called manual mechanical watches. And these watches are incredibly complicated, as you can see with this dial from the movement from this Patek Philippe watch. But the way these work is actually, you take the crown of the watch, which is this little stubby, twisty thing you see on the outside, and you use that to twist the mainspring manually. And by twisting the mainspring manually, you're storing energy in the watch that can later be delivered through the motions of the hands on the clock. And the fabulous thing about mechanical manual watches is that the designers of these watches know they're extremely exotic. And so they often include many more complications on the face of a watch. And by complications, what I mean is the number of dials on a watch will be a lot. It'll be more than just minutes, hours, and seconds. You'll see things like the moon phase, the month of the year, the day of the month, all of these incredibly complicated aspects of time that are really cool to look at on a watch face. And as you can expect, these watches are extremely expensive just because of the complexity that goes into engineering them. But now with that introduction to the mechanical sophistication of these watches, I want to give an introduction to one category of watches that's particularly recognizable, which is dive watches. And dive watches are called dive watches because they were originally designed to be used by divers to sustain deep depths in the ocean and really rigid, like shock absorbent tests. So these are very mechanically sturdy watches, but they have some key defining characteristics. The first of which is that all dive watches have this triangle or another distinguishing mark as the marker for 12. And the reason is because when you're underwater and it's dark, or you just want to quickly glance at your watch, you want to know exactly where you are on the actual face of the watch. So the 12 is always denoted by this special shape, and the 3, 6, and 9 positions always have these batons, these little sticks, for you to easily orient yourself on the watch face. Another cool feature of dive watches is that the bezel of the watch, meaning the outer border of the watch, has these markings from 0 to 60. And these are actually minute markings. And the distance between the markings grows gradually from 0 to 60. And the reason for this is because this gradual increase in time distance is actually corresponding to the way that divers are supposed to time their decompression as they're going underwater. So these are very functional watches, and they're designed to withstand these conditions. And these are just 3 of these examples. Now, the next category I want to talk about are racing watches. And as the name implies, these are watches that were traditionally used in professional racing, such as Formula One, IndyCar, and NASCAR. And these watches have a very historied background, but the key recognizing characteristic is that they all have chronometers. So chronometers are nothing but internal dials or complications on the face of a watch, which can measure things like seconds and minutes, or just other complicated timekeeping aspects. And a lot of the modern watches, like the Omega Speedmaster and the Rolex Daytona, will have a tachymeter on the bezel. So a tachymeter is just a way for you to measure units of distance on the watch itself. So you can actually tell how far you've traveled in miles or in kilometers by tracking the movement of the hands relative to the bezel and the markings on that outer edge of the clock. Now, one really cool thing about these racing watches is that they all have great heritage and legacies that make them so popular and expensive today. For example, the Tag Heuer Monaco that I showed on the left side was actually worn by Steve McQueen in the movie Le Mans. And he actually saw an actual racing driver wear this watch, and he demanded the director to give him this actual watch when he was doing the movie. Buzz Aldrin famously wore the Omega Speedmaster on Apollo 13. And for this reason, the Omega Speedmaster is known as the Moon Watch. It was the only watch that NASA approved to be sent out into space and on the moon, just due to its incredible design and sturdiness to all these elements. And finally, the Rolex Daytona, as the name implies, is actually given to the winner of the Daytona 500 every year. So it has a legacy dating back to 1963, and it's one of the most iconic racing watches out there today. Now, I've shown a little overview of the categories of watches, but here are my personal favorites out of these watches. The first one on the left is the Jaeger LeCoultre Reverso Duo Face. And the reason it's called a duo face is because this watch actually has 2 sides to it. The front side can actually be slid out and rotated to reveal a back side. And normally the 2 faces are designed to be in contrasting colors or in contrasting designs to offer you some versatility in where you can use this watch. The one on the center is the Vacheron Constantin Overseas. And this is one of the coolest watches out there, personally. That's my opinion. And the reason I think so is because it's an incredibly thin watch. It's only about 7 millimeters in thickness, but they managed to fit in so many complications into the mechanical movement of this watch. You can see that there's the day of the week, the month of the year, the day of the month, like from 1 to 31. And finally, there's actually a moon phase complication on the bottom of this watch. And they managed to fit all of these complications in such a thin package. And that's why this watch costs over $100,000. It's incredibly sophisticated and it's very rare, which is why it commands that price. And finally, on the right side, there's the Omega Seamaster Aquaterra. The Seamaster is actually a dive watch, but the Aquaterra is a derivative of this watch, which is a little more classical in its design. And the World Timer version actually shows the time zones across the world on the watch. So you can actually tell, anywhere in the world, what time is it at any time of day, which I think is really cool, especially how the globe itself is engraved into the face of this watch. So I've given you a very brief overview of the world of watches, and I think that it's interesting to me just how much diversity and complication there is to these. But I think it might be useful for all of you when the next time you see a big collection of watches like this, you're able to identify some of the characteristics between dive watches, racing watches, some of the more dressier watches like I showed in the last slide. And you might find this interesting too. So maybe you'll go down this rabbit hole like I have in the last few weeks. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and maybe you'll get a watch like this sometime in the future. Thank you.